We had begun to talk about Spanish art in the context of Italy. We had seen, for example, that El Greco on the right, the Mannerist artist El Greco, had trained in Venice before moving to Spain, where he painted this image of the Madonna and Child with two saints down below, and also Giuseppe di Ribera, who had settled in Naples in 1615, which was under Spanish control and working for a number of Spanish patrons in Naples. He also had works of art sent back to Spain to collectors there, and became an important conduit for the style of Caravaggio. So we will now be looking at other artists in Spain in the Baroque period, and what we'll see is that because Spain is deeply Catholic, and because of the fact that Spain owned territory in Italy around Naples, and because of works by artists like Ribera, the style of Caravaggio spreads strongly in 17th century Baroque Spain. Here from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, we see work by Murillo, Mary Magdalene, the prostitute, now having come to a point of revelation where she looks toward the light, understands the sins of her past, and is renouncing all of her earthly possessions. She's giving up on the ways of the world and is about to turn her life over to God as she looks toward the light itself, toward God, trying to cover herself up. Murillo never really ever went to Spain, but had seen Caravaggio's style in works of art like those by Ribera, which had been sent back to Spain, and picks up on some of his style. He can be looked at, Murillo can, as a sort of second-hand Caravaggisti working in Spain. And in this particular case, the image of the saint at the moment of her penitence is very deeply Baroque in its style, in that she's at that highly dramatic moment of conversion. Again, Baroque art, everywhere we look, loves drama, loves emotionalism, and Murillo is no different than others that we have looked at this way. For the Counter-Reformation, these saints, who are what we call penitent saints, saints repenting of their sins, at the moment of repentance became a very important theme, very, very popular theme in the early 17th century, and Murillo's fits directly into that. She's meant to be, whatever your gender, an example for you and me to think about our own priorities and reflect on them, and perhaps, like Mary Magdalene, have some kind of revelation of a better way to lead our lives. Both Murillo and Francisco Zurbarán are working in the city of Seville, which was the major economic center of Spain. And as we've seen on a number of different occasions, it is the economic centers that are the centers for art production, simply because art is a luxury item, and indeed you need to have surplus of cash in order to buy art. And there's a wide interest in the Counter-Reformation in images of saints, as you might imagine. They remember that the Counter-Reformation is where the Catholic Church is distinguishing itself against the Protestants, right? How are they different from the Protestants? And the Protestants do not believe in the cult of saints, but of course the Catholics do. And so Mary Magdalene on the right, St. Lucy on the left are both images that had great appeal in Counter-Reformation Spain as images of saints, part of what makes the Catholics Catholic. St. Lucy lived around 300, not from the time of Christ, but later. She was the daughter of a very wealthy family, and this is how Thurberon uh, depicts her in incredibly sumptuous clothing, the beautiful green, red, and blue color scheme, pearls around her neck, brooches holding on the bow on her breast, holding up the bolt of green fabric around her waist, the sumptuous linen sleeves. This is a wealthy woman from 17th century Seville, and sort of updates it to make it obvious to the viewer that we read her as being a woman from an aristocratic, wealthy family. She's carrying in one hand a plate and in the other a palm branch. The palm branch identifies her as having been martyred. That's the sign of martyrdom. We are on holiday now for Palm Sunday, and this is where that comes from. The palms laid down on Friday when Christ enters Jerusalem for his martyrdom. So she is a saint that has been martyred. She now appears in her heavenly glory, and again, totally Caravaggio inspired. Light falling down from the upper left, illuminating her. In her other hand, she holds something that helps us to identify her. It looks like a pair of oysters, but really those are her eyeballs. What happened, according to her legend, is that a young man, a suitor, found her very, very attractive, but of course she had devoted herself to God. And he said that the most attractive thing about her was her eyes. So she plucked them out so that she would no longer be attractive to this young man. Later, she was then martyred for her faith, and as they went to bury her, they found her eyes had miraculously grown back. So this is exactly as we see her at that miraculous moment when her eyes, having been plucked out and held on the plate to identify her, are also back in their sockets where they belong. Genre scenes were also important in 17th century Spain. And here we have two different scenes of everyday life. And again, very, very much influenced by Caravaggio. Murillo on the left, who's Magdalene, we had seen repenting, now shows us two prostitutes, or a prostitute with her keeper, at an open window and smiling and giggling charmingly as they look out at us. It's so charming, it's almost easy to forget that it's um, that it's a scene of what might be considered an immoral activity. Murillo's terrific at the realism and, in fact, capturing the sense that the frame of the window, the frame of the picture is actually the frame of the window and has an incredible sort of lifelike quality when you walk by the picture, as if they are there simply looking out directly at you. And again, it's a fairly large picture too. They almost 4 feet tall, which means that they're just a little bit under life size. On the right, the most famous of the 17th century Spanish painters, Diego Velázquez, and again, also for him, a scene of everyday life, a man bringing water to the people of Seville from his large jug, passing a glass of cool water to the young boy, while a man between them drinks. Velázquez, perhaps one of the greatest painters ever, in this case, again, the realism of the scene, whether it's the different kinds of surfaces he's able to depict, the unglazed large thrown pot in his hand, the glazed terracotta pot on the table, the finer porcelain cup in its mouth, or the frosty glass, all fantastically rendered. The wool of his robe, the linen of his sleeve, the difference in his craggy, sunburned, leathery face and the soft young skin of the boy who takes the water from him. Velázquez is absolutely fantastic as a painter, terrific at capturing these different realisms, if you will. And again, remember that was a hallmark set down by the Counter-Reformation and seems to apply to genre scenes every bit as much as it does to religious imagery. The question remains whether these images are meant to be moralizing or not. This is more of an open question. in 17th century Spain. We certainly saw genre scenes being very moralizing when we looked at the works from the 16th century in the Low Countries during the Reformation. But the question is whether or not these are or share that same moralizing is more open to question. And with that in mind, we'll look at sort of the best Velázquez in a local collection. This wonderful image of a woman sewing, needlewoman. An unfinished picture. He seems to have made it only for himself, not a commissioned work, never sold. It was in his collection when he died. And it's really our only autograph Velázquez in a local collection. Busy at work, and you can see that the background looks somewhat scrubbed. Velázquez is pretty good about leaving open brushwork, but this is quite unfinished, and you can see where he's sort of changed his mind on her right shoulder, on your left, brought the arm in a little closer, and if we look more closely, we can see that the hands are sort of incredibly sketchy, especially that index finger on her proper right, proper right hand. I think Velázquez is leaving it unfinished and sort of sees it nicely that way because it captures the sense of movement, that her busyness as she's sewing here. Now, the question of moral allegory. Is this meant to be an allegorical scene or just a scene of everyday life or just a study Velázquez had done of someone working in his household? When we look at images of weaving and sewing, we usually find that the women who are doing this, at least in the 17th century, are symbols of virtue, fastidiousness, dedication to task. So in this Dutch painting by Judith Leister, we see a woman sewing in a very similar fashion to Velázquez's needlewoman, resting her feet on a little foot warmer, busy at work deep into the night, and here comes a man who wants to woo her away and offer her money, obviously for other kinds of activity. Sewing was often linked to sex, as you might imagine, if you think of the activity of piercing with a needle. The sexual overtones were obvious to people, and in fact, in many languages, to sew is slang for having sex, and he is trying to lure her away from one kind of sewing to perhaps take up another kind, right? In earlier centuries, the idea of sewing and weaving and this sort of industry was also seen as a sort of sexual allure. In this case, this print around the time of Dürer, an engraving, shows a woman weaving thread, and a man obviously aroused by this activity as he plays with the hilt of his sword in a terribly provocative way. So the question remains that for Velázquez is, what is this picture all about? Is this an image of a woman who is a temptress through her activity? The ample cleavage might suggest that. Or could she be a paragon of moral virtue, of domestic virtue, like we saw with the contemporary painting by Judith Leister? And I don't think Velázquez is entirely clear. I think he wants to make it a little bit more elusive this way, and not really tying down whether there is indeed a moral message here. In 1624, Velázquez became the court painter, the official court portrait painter, to the King of Spain in Madrid, King Philip IV of Spain. This is one of his earliest portraits of Philip, full figure, all the way to his toes, holding a letter of introduction from, presumably, you and me, the people coming to see him, directly addressing us. Philip was a member of the Habsburg family, the famous Habsburg family, who were in control of much of Europe, really from around 1500 all the way through to World War I. And Velázquez becomes his court painter, stays this way for over 30 years. The Habsburg family is a fairly interesting subject in that they were using marriage as diplomacy, as a way of gathering increasing territories under their control, but also as a way of sort of shoring up the loose ends of this. So through marriage, already in around 1500, they had come into control of the Netherlands, had come under Habsburg control. Actually, by 1478, the Habsburgs had married into the Netherlands and controlled them increasingly as a sort of satellite power. In other words, staying in Spain and leaving deputies to control things in the Low Countries on their behalf. So they've married into control of the Netherlands, and through marriage diplomacy, they had also had members of their family uh, at in the courts of France and England, queens in both France and England coming from eventually Habsburg-controlled lineage. So they were using marriage not only to gain power, but also then to work as diplomacy throughout Europe. Uh, Part of what they would do, of course, would be to intermarry in order to shore up the lines of power. And through centuries of this intermarriage, the Habsburgs had become increasingly ugly, deformed, many first cousin marriages within the Habsburg dynasty. And Philip had incredibly thick lips, a very big nose, sort of a heavy jowls, and apparently was even uglier than Velazquez makes him look. But Velazquez was able to flatter him, able to make him look better. But the majority of the Habsburgs are, in fact, quite ugly. And in fact, most of Philip's children die in either childbirth or early years. He had what 9 children, and I think only 2 of them, maybe 3 of them, survived. At least early on. He may have had some later as well. This is one of his children in the center, little Princess Margarita, the daughter of Philip. And for some reason, she did not inherit his good looks. She's just as cute as a button. And she was his 9th child. Only one of those kids had survived up to this point. So he was really quite enamored with little Margarita as not only his most attractive child, but also one that survives. Now, the term Las Meninas means ladies in waiting. And what it shows is Margarita surrounded by her retinue, the 2 young women who are her attendants as she grows up, plus her in the background, in the shadow on the right, her chaperones. Over on the far right, 2 dwarves who were kept at court for entertainment. A young boy with very long hair and an older woman with the dog. This is all the sort of retinue of little Princess Margarita, and there is Velazquez himself off to your left, looking directly out at us, painting. And in the background, in the mirror behind her, we actually can see Philip himself looking, along with his wife, Mariana of Austria. It's worth mentioning here as well that this is his second wife, Mariana. She's also his niece. This is Habsburg way, right, of controlling most of Europe. So everybody's turning really, it looks like, to as if they're looking at Philip and Mariana. Because the mirror reflecting them, right? So they're standing sort of where we are, if you will, and everybody is turning and looking at us. The 2 meninas, the 2 ladies in waiting, are tending directly to little Margarita. The one on the left is serving her tea, reaches out for her. There's again Velazquez's use of sketchiness to suggest movement. Her hands not firmly resolved. The one on the right is making eye contact with us, and in fact, there are 6 figures, not counting Philip in the mirror, that are actually looking directly at us. Again, that's that Baroque interest in engagement, in participation, that we've seen in so many different works. Um, I'm quite enamored with the dog in this mastiff. Usually in the literature, you read that the little boy is kicking him, but he is not. And if you've ever owned a dog, you know that they just love having their haunches scratched with your foot. And the look on that dog's face is not a dog who's being kicked. That is a dog who is just in heaven because the little boy is scratching his bum with his foot. Now, Velazquez himself also looks directly at us, or directly at Philip, if you will. But that does sort of beg the question of what they're actually looking at. What does the mirror reflect? We know that Philip IV commissioned this work for his office so that when he looked up from the table, he would see himself in the mirror. But the figures in the mirror are far too small to be the figures looking on. They're the wrong size. They're about the right size to be standing where Velazquez is in that mirror if you do the math of the room. And that really makes this picture slightly more intriguing, a little bit more mysterious, because the mirror seems to reflect a couple standing there with a piece of red fabric pulled back from the curtain. And there we see a close-up of the mirror and how Velazquez has painted it. This idea of pulling back a bolt of fabric to reveal the two figures is a standard way of depicting full-length portraits. Here's Mariana of Austria in a full-length portrait with that bolt of fabric pulled back overhead, red fabric. It almost suggests that what's in the mirror is a painting, right? It's reflecting a painting of Philip and Mariana rather than the couple themselves. So again, are they looking at them? Are they looking at a painting? Or does the mirror maybe reflect the painting that Velazquez is making? You'll notice it's absolutely huge, Velazquez's painting is. It's about, 10, 12 feet tall. But this is exactly the same size that Las Meninas is. It's a really massive picture. And it's almost as if Velazquez is showing us a picture of him painting this picture, as if everybody maybe is looking at another mirror, placed where we are, looking back at themselves. And Velazquez taking a moment to step back from the canvas while he paints it to regard or look at these things. It's a really very interesting and mysterious image. And if we look more closely, we also notice that Velazquez is dressed far, far too nicely to be painting. He's wearing this wonderful crested robe that is a signifier of aristocratic status. As court painter, he had become very, very well stationed in society, and he shows himself as a gentleman painting. And I think that's kind of what this painting is all about, is how art makes the artist a gentleman, how art makes the artist a figure of status that gives him importance. And there are ways in which Velazquez sort of plays this through. Not only is he dressed wrong to be painting, but he's a sort of accepted member of the court circle here. And the room, which was his studio in the palace, in Philip's palace in Madrid, has pictures on the wall that we can actually identify from the court records. And both of these two pictures are Roman mythologies. They're recent paintings, they're 17th century paintings, but they're Roman mythologies, and each of them illustrates a Roman myth about artists who challenged the gods through their talent. And this again adds to the message about the importance of art to the 17th century artist. Finally, a few details that will help us to understand better sort of what we've been talking about with Velazquez and his work. I wanted to show some details because Velazquez is perhaps one of the greatest painters to ever live, and really flashy with his brushwork, where we back away from the Meninas's sleeve and it looks perfectly realistic, but then we dive in close and we can see that it's just these flashes of paint that make up the corsage on her wrist or the highlights on her sleeve. Here's a close-up of the corsage on little Infanta Margarita's blouse, and you can see that as we get close, it's just these flashy dabs of paint. Really, Velázquez is, I think, doing this on purpose because he's showing us as himself as this painter who can create things that are incredibly realistic, but at the same time they're artifice, they're paint, which is absolutely fantastic about his work, right? And here again, the sort of unresolved to the hands that are caught in motion as they move, they sort of blur out. Keep in mind, nobody had cameras yet, right? There was no way of understanding this. Velázquez uses the way in which he applies the paint to focus your eye. This is an important element. She's serving her tea, and the gestures are part of that, but they're caught in motion. And he uses tighter brush work, more resolve when it comes to the faces, because that's what he really wants you to look at.